There's a famous story in Jesus' life where he's out on the Sea of Galilee on a small boat with his best friends and his closest followers, and he falls asleep, and the storm comes in, and the storm's rocking the boat, and there's waves crashing over the side. His followers are freaking out. They wake him up, and they say, "Don't you care? Aren't you going to do anything?" And Jesus stands up, and he calms the storm. Like, just instantly, it's calm. And everyone in the boat looks at him, and they ask this question: who is this man? Who is this man? Even the wind and the waves obey him. That even those who knew him best struggled to understand, like, who is this guy? And so as we're kind of going through this Easter season, this is the question that we're asking. We're asking, who really is Jesus? Again, not just what did he do or what did he teach, but like in his core, in his essence, who is he? And today we're actually entering into what's traditionally known as Holy Week. And it's the week that leads up to the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus. And today specifically is what's called Palm Sunday. And we call it Palm Sunday because Palm Sunday celebrates this pretty significant event in the life of Jesus. Here's kind of an artist's rendering of what someone thinks Palm Sunday might have looked like. Palm Sunday is the day that Jesus rode into the town of Jerusalem for the last time, because this is what starts Holy Week, and then Holy Week ultimately ends up with his death, burial, and resurrection. But today starts that. Today starts Palm Sunday. And Palm Sunday it's a big deal. It's a part of this week that in Jesus' life, if you go back to Jesus' life, they didn't call it Palm Sunday in Jesus' life. They just called it, hey, this is the week leading into Passover. The whole reason that Jesus was coming to Jerusalem on Palm Sunday was to celebrate Passover. Now, Passover is the national holiday of the nation of Israel. And it's a pilgrimage holiday. It celebrates this event in the Old Testament known as the Exodus, where Moses leads the Israelites out of slavery in Egypt. They go to the land of Canaan. They settle down. They become the nation of Israel. This is what Passover celebrated. And so in the first century world that Jesus lives in, when Passover would come, there would be good, devout Jewish people from all over the world that would make the pilgrimage to Jerusalem to celebrate Passover, which is exactly what Jesus and his followers were doing. They were coming to Jerusalem to celebrate the Passover. Now, at the point in which Palm Sunday actually happens, Jesus has been teaching and performing miracles for about 2 to 3 years at this point. And during those 2 to 3 years, he's made some enemies, some pretty significant, oftentimes powerful enemies. And as he comes riding into Jerusalem, the opposition against him is just growing. Now, in addition to enemies, Jesus also has a few, not very many, but he has a few very core followers. These are people that are like committed to him. What he has a lot of still at this point are fans. These people that are hopeful of who he might be, of what he might do. And see, Palm Sunday is all about this huge crowd of essentially fans that gathers to welcome him into Jerusalem in anticipation of what he might do. And so when he comes to Jerusalem, here's how he's greeted. Matthew records this in his gospel, his account of the life of Jesus. Matthew 21, 7-9. He says, that's his followers, they brought the donkey and the colt and placed their cloaks on them for Jesus to sit on. Now, a very large crowd spread their cloaks on the road, while others cut palm branches from the trees, or branches from the trees, and spread them on the road. The crowds that went ahead of him and those that followed shouted, "Hosanna to the Son of David. Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. Hosanna in the highest heaven." So this is the event that comes to be known as Palm Sunday, because he's greeted as he rides into town by this huge crowd with cloaks and they're waving branches. Now, it's important for us to understand that Palm Sunday, everything that's happening on Palm Sunday, what this crowd does when they welcome Jesus into Jerusalem is filled with significance to Jewish history and to Jewish religion. First of all, and maybe the thing that's most obvious to first century Jews who are engaging in Palm Sunday, this is a recreation of the Maccabean victory parade. So if you go back to the year 167 BCE, so about 167 years before Jesus shows up, at that period of time, the nation of Israel, the land of Israel, was under the control of the Seleucid Empire, which was a Greek empire. They had emerged after Alexander the Great conquered everything, then he died, then there's all these like little Greek kingdoms that emerge. So the Seleucid Empire is one of these Greek kingdoms. They take control of most of Israel. They take control of Jerusalem. They outlaw traditional Jewish worship, and it's just a rough time. this revolt happens, known as the Maccabean Revolt, and a guy by the name of Judas Maccabees leads his army, known as the Hammer, into Jerusalem. They free Jerusalem. They overthrow the Seleucid Empire from controlling that. The Seleucid Empire is still around, but they no longer control Jerusalem. So they free Jerusalem, they cleanse the temple, and they restore traditional Jewish worship. And so when Maccabees leads his army into Jerusalem, they are greeted by people who are waving palm branches and shouting at them. They come riding into town, actually on horses is what they ride in. But this is that what's happening with Jesus here on Palm Sunday is a recreation of that Maccabean victory parade. And so what it is clearly is this crowd of people is asking Jesus to do the same thing. Hey, we want you to lead a revolt, a violent revolt, because that's what Maccabees does. He's a military leader. We want you to lead a violent revolt against Rome, overthrow them, kick them out, and then reestablish this as our traditional homeland and our kingdom and kind of restore everything to what it should be. So it is a request from this huge crowd for Jesus to be the new Maccabees, for him to lead the new revolt. So that's the history side of it. There's also a lot of religious significance to what happens on Palm Sunday. First of all, as Jesus is riding into town, they're shouting to him, Hosanna, which means save us. Literally in this case, it is God save us. So they're greeting him with these palm branches, which were a symbol of victory. So they're greeting him with palm branches, asking him to lead this revolt, and they're shouting, God save us, which is a direct quote from Psalm 118. Psalm 118 is a psalm in the Old Testament, and it's a psalm, it's like this poem, this song that's specifically about the Messiah. And the Messiah is the one that Jewish people believed God would send to make everything right. The Messiah was actually going to come out of the line of King David, the great Israelite king. And out of his family line would come this Messiah, this new king who would make everything right and would restore the Davidic kingdom to Israel. And what makes it even more significant is that as Jesus comes riding in, he's riding on a donkey, which in ancient Israel, if you read the Old Testament, is a royal animal. That's the animal kings would ride. So Jesus comes riding into town on this royal animal, signifying that he's a king. He's greeted by this crowd of people that are hopeful that he is the Messiah. He is going to be the new king. They're shouting, God save us, and they're asking him to lead this revolt, this violent revolt to overthrow Rome. That's what's happening in this whole scene. Everyone knows it, and Jesus knows it. He's very well aware of what is happening. And what's interesting about Jesus is a lot of times Jesus kind of tends to shy away from the spotlight. If you read Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, the four Gospels that talk about his life, people try to push him and he'll step back. Jesus acknowledges clearly in this that he understands himself to be a king because he rides a donkey into town through this epic greeting. If Jesus wanted to push back against the idea that he was a king, he just would have not ridden the donkey. He knew exactly what he's doing. So he rides into town with this acknowledgement that he is a king, and he's greeted with these people who are making it very clear exactly what kind of king they want him to be and exactly what it is they want him to do. But remember, at this point, he's got a few loyal followers, some pretty heavy opposition, but a whole bunch of fans that are hopeful in what it is that he could do. Matthew tells us that after Jesus rides into Jerusalem, he goes straight to the temple. The temple was this mammoth structure where people would go to worship God. For Jewish people, they believed that God actually lived in the temple. And the temple during the Passover season was crowded with people. Because again, you had all these people who had come to Jerusalem for the Passover. And it's filled with all kinds of religious excitement, religious anticipation. You can see that in Palm Sunday. There's all this hope. We found this candidate that might be the Messiah. Now, when you came to Jerusalem for Passover, you were required to offer sacrifices. That was a part of traditional worship. And Jewish law stated that you had to buy those sacrifices in Jerusalem. You couldn't bring them from out of town. You had to come to Jerusalem. So when Jesus goes straight to the temple after all of Palm Sunday, he goes straight to the temple, and what he finds is in the court of the Gentiles, there's all these people that are buying and selling sacrifices, and they're exchanging money. Because people had traveled from all over the place, they had different currency. So before you could buy a sacrifice in Jerusalem, you might have to exchange your currency for local currency, then you could buy it. Now, the court of the Gentiles was the most outer court of the temple. And it was the only court that Gentiles could go to. A Gentile was anyone who was not a Jew. So if you have a Jewish mind frame, you have Jews, you have Gentiles. There was an inner part of the temple that Jews could go to, and an even more inner part where women weren't even allowed. But the court of the Gentiles was the only place that Gentiles could go. So when Jesus walks into the temple, he finds this area, the only part of the temple Gentiles can go to, and there's all of this business that's taking place. And here's what Jesus does. Matthew 21, verse 12. Jesus entered the temple courts, and he drove out all who were buying and selling there. He overturned tables. He overturned the tables of the money changers and the benches of those selling doves. It is written, he said to them, my house will be called a house of prayer, but you are making it a den of robbers. So Jesus walks in and he sees this scene of what's happening. He gets angry. He overturns all of these tables. He causes a huge scene, and he kind of really is very critical of what it is that's happening there. Now, really, there's kind of two things going on that Jesus references. One, Jesus says you're making it a den of robbers, which a lot of biblical scholars will kind of look at, and they think that Jesus is speaking to the probability that these people are ripping other people off. Because you had to buy your sacrifices in Jerusalem. You couldn't bring it from out of town. So if you're required to buy it here, we can jack up the price and charge you more. And there's potential that's happening. We don't really know that, but there's strong potential. But if you look at Jesus' words, what Jesus seems more angry about is actually where all of this is taking place. Because according to Jewish law, you just had to buy the sacrifices in Jerusalem. It didn't have to be the temple. You could have put them anywhere in Jerusalem. But they chose to put them in the temple, and in the one place in the temple that Gentiles could go. So this one place that's designed for people to go and to meet with God and to encounter God and to worship God. None of that is happening because people are making money and they're using this space to conduct their business. So this is why Jesus is super angry. This is why he overthrows all these tables. This is why he makes this big scene. And also, for what it's worth, this is why he gets killed. This is the event that finally leads to Jesus' execution. Now, we've said that Jesus already had opposition up until this point. He had growing opposition. There was this group known as the Pharisees that were like experts in religious law. The Pharisees were influential like in local communities, local synagogues. But when Jesus goes to the temple and he overturns the tables, what he does is he crosses another group known as the Sadducees. And the Sadducees were this religious group that controlled the temple. The Sadducees worked in league with Rome. The Sadducees are the ones that had the real political power. Because they basically said, hey, we'll keep the peace here, and you just let us keep our power and control. And so they worked a lot with Rome. So when Jesus goes in and makes a scene in the temple, now he's threatening the Sadducees, and a week later he's dead. Now, the Sadducees know, even when Jesus comes in there and makes this big scene in the temple, they can't just get rid of it. They can't, because, again, he's so popular, and you saw how people greeted him, literally hours before he came in and turned over these tables. So we got to be real sneaky about this. We can't just make him disappear. We can't just openly execute him. We've got to be really clever. So what the Sadducees do is they get one of Jesus' closest friends, one of his followers, to agree to betray him. The other brilliant thing they do is all the religious passion that exists in Jerusalem at this time. Again, all these people that are here for the Passover because they're excited. They're excited because Jesus might be the Messiah. This might be the one. They manage to manipulate all of that passion and turn it against Jesus and turn it on Jesus when Jesus doesn't do what this crowd thinks that he should do. So by doing that, they're able to arrest Jesus and they hand him over to the Romans. The reason they hand him over to the Romans is technically only the Romans were allowed to execute people. Now, Jewish leaders would do it from time to time, and so it's not that they never did it, but again, in a case like Jesus, he's so popular that if you execute him, you risk turning the public against you. So if we can get Rome to kill him, it's just neat and clean. It's not on us, like it's on them. Nobody likes them anyway, so this is the best way to do it. So they try Jesus, they find him guilty, they hand him over to the Romans, and he ends up on trial before a guy named Pilate, who's the local Roman governor. And if you flip over to one of the other Gospels, one of the other accounts of Jesus' life, written by John, who's one of Jesus' closest followers, John gives us a lot of the details of the trial between Pilate and Jesus. And what's interesting is central to this trial is whether or not Jesus is a king. This is what Pilate's trying to figure out, because really the charges that have been levied against Jesus is, hey, he's claiming to be a king, which again goes back to the whole Messiah thing, the whole him riding a donkey. He's claiming to be a king, and if you claim to be a king within the Roman Empire, that's called treason. It's treason against the empire. It's treason against Caesar. So that's a capital offense. So this is what's at the heart of Pilate and Jesus' discussion, as Pilate's trying to figure out, like, is this guy guilty? Should he be condemned? Should I execute him? John says this, John 18, 33 through 35. Pilate then went back inside the palace. He summoned Jesus and he asked him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" "Is that your own idea?" Jesus asked. "Or did others talk to you about me?" "Am I a Jew?" Pilate replied. "Your own people and chief priests handed you over to me. What is it that you have done?" And so Pilate, really in a lot of ways, is kind of like this tragic figure. And I'm not saying that to excuse anything that he does, but Pilate finds himself trapped in essentially what is this power struggle, where Pilate is appointed the local leader, the local governor by Rome, and he's accountable to Rome. And really what Rome wants is keep the peace, because if you keep the peace, we keep our power. And so in order to keep the peace, Pilate has to work with groups like the Sadducees, who control the temple, and they do all that. And so Pilate now finds himself torn between, if a riot breaks out here, I'm going to get in trouble, so I gotta appease the local leader, but I also got to appease Rome, and what do I do? And you can tell, even just from this brief interaction, Pilate doesn't really think Jesus did anything wrong. And Pilate's trying to figure out what is happening. So he's asking Jesus these questions, and Jesus responds, and Pilate's like, I'm not even Jewish. I don't even know what's going on here. This is some kind of Jewish thing. Your leadership handed you over to me. I don't feel like you've done anything wrong, but I don't know what's going on here. So again, I'm not excusing anything that Pilate does, just appreciating this power struggle that's going on between the Sadducees, who see Jesus as a threat, and they want to get rid of him to hold on to their power, and even the power of Rome. And so Pilate's trying to figure out what's going on, and he doesn't know what's happening, and Jesus is like, what do you think? Did someone else tell you this? And it's like his mind's just blowing up. Verse 36. Jesus said, "My kingdom is not of this world. If it were, my servants would fight to prevent my arrest by the Jewish leaders. But now my kingdom is from another place." So in the midst of this trial where Pilate's trying to figure out, are you a king? Are you not a king? Did you do anything? They say you did something. Here, Jesus finally makes this statement where he acknowledges, clearly he says, yes, I am a king. I have a kingdom. But it's not what you think. My kingdom is not anything like what you think. See, kingdoms in the first century world, in the ancient world, and even in the modern world, kingdoms are held together by violence and power. That's what holds a kingdom together, is you have the power, and then you have the ability, even if you don't do it, but you have the ability with force and with violence to exercise that power. That's what makes a kingdom. That's what holds a kingdom together. That's what makes a nation. That's what holds a nation together. It's violence and power. This is what everyone wanted from Jesus, and this is where they thought everything was going. In fact, if you go back to when Jesus is arrested, in the Garden of Gethsemane, when Jesus is arrested, his few followers that have stuck with him, they want to fight. They bring a sword to the Garden of Eden. We think of the Garden of Eden as it's this thing where Jesus goes and he prays. His closest followers are armed. They pull their swords. One guy attacks another guy and cuts off his ear. They wanted to fight. And Jesus said, no, put it away. And then he heals the guy. He says, we're not doing this because my kingdom, it is a kingdom. I am a king. But it's not like what you think of when you think of king. In fact, my kingdom's not going to make any sense to you. And all the things Jesus has said up until this point about his kingdom, he said things like, the first are last and the last are first. The meek will inherit the earth. Blessed are you when you're persecuted. That's what Jesus said. And let's just be real honest, we don't believe those things. And neither did the first century world. Where in our world do the meek inherit the earth? Nowhere. Where do we look at anybody and go, look how blessed that person is? They're being persecuted. No, we don't do that any more than the first. His kingdom, what he said about his kingdom makes just as little sense to us as it did to anybody in the first century Roman world. And this is Jesus' point. He's like, yeah, I'm a kingdom, but it's not like what you think. You can't even grasp it. You can't even imagine it. So here's how Pilate responds. Verse 37, he says, you are a king then, said Pilate. Jesus answered, you say that I'm a king. In fact, the reason I was born and came into the world is to testify to the truth. Everyone on the side of truth listens to me. So Pilate says, well, there it is. You said you're a king. Jesus actually makes this statement. He says, kingship is the whole reason I came to this world. That's what my life has been about since the beginning. That's why I'm here. This is the reason that I came, to establish kingship in a kingdom. Now, Pilate's still confused. Pilate still wants to let Jesus off because he doesn't think he did anything wrong, but he gets pressured in a lot of ways. He gets bullied into it by the Sadducees, the religious leaders, who again have manipulated the passion of this crowd and turned it against Jesus because Jesus wouldn't do what they asked him to do at the beginning of the week. So he ends up having Jesus beaten, tortured, and crucified. And when he's crucified, John 19:19, he places a sign above Jesus. Pilate had a notice prepared and fastened to the cross, and it read, Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews. And that sign is meant to mock both Jesus and the Jewish people. That here's your king. Here's a guy who claimed to be your king. Here's a guy that at least at some point a lot of you thought was your king, and now here he is dying a criminal's death. Crucifixion was a way to torture people. It was also a way to humiliate people. So it serves as a warning to any other would-be messiahs. So Jesus is crucified. He dies. They take him down, and they bury him. And this week that started out so promising, where Jesus rides into town and people are greeting and they're cheering. And in just a few days, that whole thing turns. And Jesus ends up buried, dead, in a tomb. All the fans have scattered because Jesus wasn't who they wanted him to be. And the few faithful followers that he had are devastated. And they're devastated on two fronts. One, they've just lost a friend. There's the grief that comes with losing someone that you love. But two, the embarrassment, the shame, the despair that comes with this thing that you never thought could happen. You were so certain that you were right. You were so certain that this was the Messiah. You were so certain that this was your king. You were so certain that he was going to establish this kingdom. How could this have ever happened? When the moment of confrontation came, why didn't he fight? Why did he just step back and take it? Why did he allow himself to be arrested? Why did he not defend himself? Why didn't he fight back ever? And it's the despair that just comes with, I was totally wrong. And what I never thought could happen, happened. A couple weeks ago, I was playing video games with my son. And we were playing Super Mario Odyssey, which if you've never played it, is a phenomenal video game for what it's worth. And it's a Mario game, and if you're familiar with Mario games at all, you know that Mario is like the little plumber, and he usually has like a red shirt and blue overalls and a red hat. One of the things that distinguishes Mario in Super Mario Odyssey is his hat has these big eyes on it. His hat is actually like a living character that helps him through, and he throws it and jumps on it and everything. And so Jeremy's playing the game, and I'm just kind of sitting there watching, and we're talking, and there's this one part in the game where you have to walk in, and it shows you a picture of Mario. And then you have to recreate the picture. And so when you create the picture, then you get rewarded. You get like a star, which is what you're supposed to get in the game. And so Jeremy tried to recreate this picture like 3 or 4 times, and he kept getting it wrong. And I told him, I said, Jeremy, the reason you're getting the picture wrong is because you're not drawing the eyes on the hat. And he goes, Dad, in this picture, you don't have to do that. The eyes aren't there. I was like, Jeremy, this is Super Mario Odyssey. They're always there. And again, the way this activity in the video game started is they showed you the picture, and then you had to recreate it. was like, Jeremy, you're not putting the eyes. And he's like, Dad, the eyes are not in this picture. You don't. And I looked at him, I said, Jeremy, they're there, I'll bet you. And he goes, okay. And I said, Jeremy, I'm gonna bet you $100 that the eyes are in that picture. Now here's the thing you have to understand about me. I don't bet, I don't gamble. Like my wife, her roommate, when they were in college, was from Las Vegas, and so sometimes we'd like go there when we were like in college because our parents let us stay at their house, and we'd go up and down the strip, and sometimes we'd go into casinos and we'd gamble. I would only ever put like $5 on a hand of blackjack. There was one time where I put like $20 down on a hand of blackjack, and like I was like hyperventilating because it's just the stress. So I just don't bet because it's like I just get this anxiety when I bet. And so there's been times with my kids where I've said things like that, like, hey, I'll bet you this, and I'll bet them some extraordinary amount of money because I never make them pay. It's just kind of me being funny. So when I said I'll bet you $100, I wasn't betting because I knew. Like I knew. And Jeremy goes back to the beginning of the little mini game, and the picture comes up, and sure enough, Mario has no eyes. And I sat there on the couch, speechless. And he looked at me, and my wife was right there. She was in the kitchen. She looked at me. And my son, he was speechless too, which if you know my son, it's hard for him to be speechless. And so he looks at me like kind of smiling, and he goes, I just won $100. And I just sat there, and I had nothing to say to him. I had nothing to say to Linda. I was like dumbfounded. I was embarrassed. I was like, I was sure I was right. Like it wasn't, in my mind, it wasn't a gamble. It wasn't a bet. I was sure, I knew. Well, I was wrong. But I was sure I knew. And so I just sat there. I don't know if you've ever done this. I sat there for like 5 or 10 minutes just in utter disbelief. Like I couldn't believe I was wrong, and I couldn't believe what happened. And see, in addition to the grief that Jesus' movement is feeling at his death, they also have this bewilderment and this confusion and this despair and this sitting there like, I was so sure. I bet everything on this. I left everything. I literally went all in. And now he's dead in a tomb. And he wouldn't even fight. When it came down to it, he wouldn't fight. He wouldn't let us fight. He just stood back and he took it. And see, what his followers didn't understand is that he did fight. He was fighting. That was the point of all of it. He just wasn't fighting Pilate or Caesar or Rome. And he wasn't fighting for a localized kingdom on a specific piece of real estate. Jesus' idea of kingship and kingdom were a lot bigger than that. That there's this word that Scripture uses all throughout the Old and New Testament to describe the things in our lives and the things in our world that bring death and destruction. And the word is sin. It's a word that we don't like, and a lot of times sin is a word that gets weaponized by people. But sin, we tend to think of sin as behaviors, right? It's this thing that you do. That's a sin, that's a sin, that's a sin. But if you look in Scripture, before sin is a behavior, before it's a verb, it's a noun. It is a thing. It is a force. It is a power that controls us. All these things that we do that are rooted in selfishness or pride or pleasure or whatever, all these things that we do that end up causing hurt and pain and death and destruction in our lives and in the lives of the people around us and in the world, what Scripture says is they're all rooted in sin. That's why Paul in Romans, he has this great section where he talks about, he goes, I don't understand myself. All the things I want to do, I don't do. All the things I don't want to do, I do. And Paul's conclusion is he says, this is sin living in me. It is this power, it is this force that is everywhere. And Jesus literally says it controls us. When we sin, it's because we are slaves to sin. And what Jesus understands is the real force of death and destruction in the world isn't Caesar or Pilate or Rome. Now, Jesus is not dismissing those and saying they don't matter. Jesus cares very much about the realities that exist within nations and within communities and within groups, and he wants them to be just. But Jesus understands the bigger issue is sin. Is all these things happen on a societal level. All these things happen at a systemic level. All these things happen at an individual level because of sin. Sin is the common power in all of this. And so what Jesus fights is sin. Paul writes, 2 Corinthians 5:21, he says, God made him who had no sin to be sin for us, so that in him we might become the righteousness of God. See, on the cross, Jesus becomes what he wasn't in order to overcome what we never could. This is what Paul's getting at. Paul's saying, listen, when he goes to the cross, he becomes a thief and a liar and a robber and an adulterer and an oppressor and an abuser and a gossip and an addict and a fraud. He becomes me. And he becomes you. He becomes what he never was in order to overcome what we never could. Because the only way to overcome sin is to endure it. See, people wanted a violent revolt. What Jesus gave them was a violent revolt. But he was the object of the violence. He took all of that hurt, all of that pain, all of that force, all of that evil, all of that sin, all of that destruction upon himself so that he could overcome it. Jesus' death isn't about appeasing an angry God. He is God in the flesh. Dying to appease yourself is stupid. Jesus' death was about overcoming sin to make a whole new creation. The Jesus' kingdom wasn't just one geographic piece of land. It was the cosmos. He was bringing all of the cosmos back under God. That's what his death, that's what his resurrection is about. That's why after his resurrection, by the way, the death of Jesus is not the end of the story. You should come back next week. It'll be really good. But in Matthew 28:18, here's what Jesus says after his resurrection. He says, all authority on earth and in heaven has been given to me. I'm the king. Not just of one place, not just of one people. Because of my death and resurrection, all of creation is brought back under the kingship and into the kingdom of God. And all things are being made new. This is why Paul writes in 2 Corinthians 5:17, he says, therefore, if anyone is in Christ, the new creation has come. The old is gone and the new is here. See, Jesus' death, ultimately his resurrection, is about his fighting. It's about violence, but not what you give out to other people. It's about what he absorbs in himself in order to overcome death and sin and destruction. See, you and I, you know what sin most produces in our life? In addition to all the death and destruction around us, it produces guilt and shame. And how much of our lives, how much of what we do, how much of what we feel is rooted in guilt or shame? Sometimes it's shame and guilt for things we've done. Sometimes it's shame or guilt for things that have been done to us. But we carry all of this around. We try to pretend like everything's okay, but it's not. Which is why we are this stressed out, just internally dying, dividing culture that's just collapsing under the weight of all of this hurt and pain and shame and guilt. And the whole point of Jesus going to the cross was to become that, to embody that, in order to overcome it, to make a new way, to begin a new creation. See, Paul will describe the New Testament. He'll say, Jesus is the first fruits of the new creation. And we are invited to join him. And I said in the beginning, but this is what being in Christ is all about. This is what baptism is all about. It's not about figuring everything out. It's not about solving everything. It's not about having all the answers. It's about saying, you know what? I've carried shame and pain and guilt long enough. I've let sin destroy my life. I've let it eat me up. And I don't want to live that way anymore. That's the old way. That in Jesus, there is a new way. A way that's rooted in freedom. A way that's rooted in transformation. A way that's rooted in life. And so baptism is this simple thing that says that's what I want to be a part of. Jesus says we live in a world where there's weeds and wheat. One's dying, one's coming to life. And through his death and resurrection, he invites us to participate in the life that is new creation. I want to ask you all to do me a favor. I want to ask you all to stand up right now. And we're gonna sing a song. And if you would like to get baptized, we have people, if you look just kind of the outsides of the screens here, we have people that are right there that you can just walk over to them and we have all the stuff in the back. We have shorts and shirts and everything you can wear. And if you want to go back there now, you can. If you want to get baptized as we sing this song, make your way over there. And I know, I get this is like really awkward. And if you're an introvert like me, you're like, the last thing I want to do is walk around. I understand all of that. And so if that's you, look, I'll wait down here and you find me and we'll walk together and I'll go with you. Because I'm going to get in there too, and we're going to celebrate anybody who wants to do this today. And man, I'd encourage you. I know sometimes it's uncomfortable, and I know it's like a lot of things race through our mind, like, am I worthy? Am I worthy? If what's racing through your mind is, are you worthy? Can I just tell you something? That is like a evil satanic thought. Not that you are evil, but that is working against what Jesus is doing. What Jesus does by going to the cross is tell you, you are worthy. And I do love you, and I do want something new, and I want something more for you. So as we sing this song, if you want to get baptized today, then go to one of those signs, find one of those people there, just on the by those red exit signs there, or I'll be down front. You can come down and grab me, and we'll go back there together. But let's sing this together.